sky over the harbor was gray and heavy with clouds, yet the air felt strange and restless, as if something was waiting to happen, and nobody knew what it was. People moved about as usual, carrying boxes of fish, shouting about prices, and waving their hands at the boats that came in and went out, and no one paid much attention to the quiet figure walking slowly down the wooden pier. She was just a woman in plain civilian clothes, her jacket old, her shoes dusty, her hair tied back in, a loose braid, and her face calm but unreadable. She looked like anyone else, yet somehow not like anyone at all. The fishermen stared at her as she passed by, wondering what she was doing there. She carried no bag, no basket, no fishing gear, and her eyes were fixed on the open water as if the sea itself had called her name. An old man whispered to his friend that maybe she was lost, or maybe she was waiting for someone. But his friend laughed and said she was probably a dreamer, one of those who come to the harbor to stare at the waves and pretend to think deep thoughts. A group of young boys laughed loudly when she walked by. One of them shouted, "Hey lady, you waiting for your prince to come sailing in?" The others roared with laughter, but the woman did not look at them. She kept walking, her steps slow and even like the rhythm of the tide. The crowd did not like that. She did not respond. Some felt curious, others felt annoyed. People do not like silence when they expect a reaction. It makes them uneasy, so they watched her even more closely, trying to guess who she was and why she was there. The woman reached the end of the pier and stood still, her hands resting on the wooden rail, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the fog. She breathed deeply and the wind caught her hair, blowing it gently across her face. She did not move. She only whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. A young fisherman nearby smirked and said, "She is praying to the sea gods, maybe. She wants the fish to bless her." Another man laughed and said, "Maybe she wants to jump in and join the dolphins." The laughter grew louder until it filled the air, mixed with the cries of the seagulls and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. But even as the noise rose, the woman remained still, her calmness strange and almost frightening, like a quiet. Before a storm, one of the fishermen finally walked up to her and said, "Miss, are you lost? This is no place to stand all day." She turned, her head slowly, and looked at him, her eyes deep and steady like the ocean after a storm, and said quietly, "I am waiting for the signal." The man blinked, confused. "Signal? What signal?" he asked, but she said nothing more. She turned back to the sea and kept watching the horizon as if expecting something to rise from the deep. The crowd began to whisper again. Some said she was mad, others said she was a spy. Someone joked that maybe she was waiting for aliens, but no one dared to stand too close to her anymore because there was something about her presence that felt serious and heavy. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. The laughter faded. People got bored and went back to their work. Only a few stayed near, watching her from a distance. Among them was an old sailor with a white beard and tired eyes. His name was Thomas, and he had seen many strange things in his life. Thomas studied the woman carefully and noticed her hands were not the hands of a regular traveler. They were rough and marked, with faint scars like someone who had handled ropes, metal, or weapons before. He also saw that she carried a folded paper in her pocket, and every few minutes her fingers touched it like it was something precious or dangerous. Thomas felt a chill on his neck as the wind changed direction. It came colder now, sharper, smelling faintly of oil and iron. He looked at the sea and saw the fog thickening in strange patterns. The waves began to move oddly, not like the natural push and pull of the tide, but like something heavy stirring beneath the surface. The woman's lips moved again. She whispered something that sounded like coordinates. Thomas leaned forward, trying to hear, but a sudden clap of thunder rolled across the sky, even though there were no signs of rain, and for a moment everyone at the harbor froze. The sound did not come from the clouds, it came from far away deep in the sea. A deep metallic echo that felt more like a warning than thunder. The woman's eyes flashed as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. She straightened her back and took the folded paper from her pocket. Her fingers opened it slowly, revealing a map covered in lines and symbols that only a sailor or a soldier would understand. She looked at it once, then folded it again and said softly to herself, "They are right on time." The laughter that had filled the harbor earlier was gone now. Only the sound of the wind and the uneasy slapping of waves against the dock remained. Thomas stared at the woman, feeling the weight of fear settling in his chest. He did not know what she was waiting for, but he knew it was something that would change everything. Far out in the mist, something groaned like the sea itself was moving, and from somewhere deep in the fog came a faint low hum, steady and rhythmic, almost like the heartbeat of a giant machine. The people on the pier looked at each other, confused, scared, and silent. The woman in civilian clothes did not move. She just stood there, eyes fixed. On the fog, her voice calm and low as she said, "They have arrived." The sound from the sea grew deeper and heavier as the morning turned into noon. The waves were restless, the air thick with fog, and something unseen moved far out in the water. Yet most people in the harbor tried to ignore it, pretending everything was fine. The woman in civilian clothes still stood at the edge of the pier, her hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if she could see through the fog itself. People began to gather again, drawn by curiosity and gossip, because in small towns silence never lasts long, and neither does mystery. Children pointed at her, whispering that she was strange and maybe cursed. Young men laughed and said she was acting, like a ghost waiting for her sailor lover to return. Some women shook their heads and muttered that she must be mad to stand in the cold without moving for so long. One boy tried to get close, waving a stick at her and saying, "Hey lady, what are you?" looking for fish or mermaids, but she did not answer. She did not even turn her head, and that made him uneasy because it felt like she was hearing something far beyond them all. The old sailor Tomas was still watching from a distance, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his fishing net tighter with every strange sound that came from the sea. He had lived long enough to know the ocean had moods, and that day it felt angry and waiting. Thomas walked slowly toward her, ignoring the laughter behind him, and said softly, "Miss, you should come inside. The tide is rising and storms can come fast." But the woman only shook her head, her voice quiet, yet firm. "Not a storm." She said, "Something else is coming." When she said that, a chill went through him like ice in his veins. Something about her tone was not fear but certainty, the kind of certainty only someone who had seen danger before could have. The crowd began to grow louder again, trying to cover their nervousness with mockery. One man shouted, "Look, she is talking to the sea now. Maybe she thinks she can order the waves to stop." Another yelled, "Maybe she is calling the sea monsters for dinner." The woman slowly turned around and faced them, her expression calm, her eyes sharp and steady. She said in a voice that carried through the wind, "They are testing their weapons. You laugh now, but you will not when you see what lies beneath that fog." Her words made a few people uneasy, but others just laughed harder, thinking she was spinning. Tails, an old woman in the crowd, spat on the ground and said, "This is nonsense. What weapons? What war? We have peace." The woman's lips curved slightly into something between a smile and sorrow. "Peace," she repeated quietly. "Peace is only the space between two storms." Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded paper again, opening it carefully. Thomas leaned closer and gasped when he saw it. The lines, the coordinates, the marks that only someone from the Navy or the Army could understand. The map was not for fishing or travel. It was a military chart of the coast. The woman traced her finger along one of the lines, whispering numbers under her breath before folding it again. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memory. The crowd did not notice the details. They only saw paper and strange behavior, and that was enough to feed their laughter again. "Look, she has a treasure map," someone shouted. "Maybe she is hunting gold." Someone else said, "Maybe she lost her ship and is waiting for it to come back from the dead." The laughter echoed louder, but Thomas could no longer join them. He stared at the sea, where the fog seemed thicker now, and in that fog, he thought he saw faint flashes of light blinking in a pattern like a code-like communication. He stepped back, heart pounding, and turned to the woman. "You know what that is, don't you?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "Yes," she said, "and they should not be this close. Not here, not now." The wind picked up, cold and sharp, whipping through the harbor. The seagulls began to cry wildly, circling above the water as if warning of danger. The smell of salt grew stronger, mixed with something metallic and burning. The laughter finally began to fade. People looked around nervously, their smiles weak, their jokes dying in their throats. Thomas looked at them all and shouted, "You fools! This is not a show. This is a warning." The woman took one slow step forward, standing at the very edge of the pier, her boots almost touching the waves. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a few words no one could understand, then opened them again. Her gaze hard as steel. She said, "They have started the test, and now it is too late to hide." A low hum spread through the air, the kind that made bones vibrate and hearts skip. It grew louder and louder until even the children covered their ears. The fog began to glow faintly with a pale light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Thomas whispered, "What is that?" But before anyone could answer, the water at the end of the harbor rippled violently as if something massive was moving beneath it. The crowd gasped, some screamed, others began to back away, but the woman did not move. Her hair blew wildly. In the wind, her eyes locked on the sea. She said in a calm voice, "It begins now." The sound rose higher, deeper and closer. The fog twisted like smoke, and the faint shadow of something enormous began to form beneath the waves. The crowd that had laughed at her only minutes ago stood frozen silent and trembling as the ocean itself seemed to awaken, and the woman in civilian clothes waited with the stillness of someone who had seen war and survived it. And as the first deep metallic roar came from the fog, Thomas realized with dread that she had not come to watch the sea. She had come to warn them of what the sea was about to bring. The air was heavy with fear as the strange hum from the sea grew stronger, shaking the wooden pier and sending ripples across the harbor. The people who had mocked the woman now stood frozen, staring at the water that seemed alive and restless. The woman in civilian clothes stood firm, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the glowing fog, her jacket fluttering in the cold wind. Her hands steady while everyone else trembled. Thomas, the old sailor, felt his knees weaken but forced himself to stay near her, because something inside him told him she knew what was happening. The children began to cry, the younger. Fishermen shouted to run, the older ones whispered prayers under their breath, but no one dared to move away from the sight, because curiosity was stronger than courage, and fear, mixed with wonder, can hold a crowd tighter than any rope. The fog pulsed, again a faint light flickering within it like lightning trapped underwater. The woman watched it closely, her lips moving as if counting seconds in her head. 1, 2, 3. She whispered quietly, then nodded, as if confirming something unseen. Thomas leaned closer and said, "What are you counting?" But she did not answer. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small metal badge covered in scratches and salt. Her thumb brushed across the faded engraving, and Thomas saw letters carved into it, Naval Command Division. He gasped and said, "You were in the Navy, weren't you?" The woman gave a small nod, her voice low and firm. "Once, yes. Not anymore, but the sea never forgets its soldiers." The crowd murmured nervously, some now realizing she was not a madwoman or a beggar, but someone who had lived through storms they could never imagine. But others still clung to disbelief, shouting that she was lying, that there was no ship, no danger, just tricks of fog and fear. The woman turned, her eyes toward them, and said, "You think this is fog, but it is not. It is the smoke of engines below you. Think the sea is calm, but it hides something that should not be here." Her voice carried weight like steel cutting through wind. The laughter stopped. The whispers faded. Only the sound of the waves and the echo of her words filled the air. Thomas felt his heart pounding faster. He said, "Engines. What kind of engines?" She looked at him quietly and said, "The kind that do not belong to this side of the border." A gasp spread through the crowd because everyone knew what that meant. An enemy vessel in their waters. The woman unfolded her map again, her fingers tracing the coordinates marked in red ink. She said, "They are testing how close they can come. Before being detected, they move in silence under cover of fog, but they are not as invisible as they think. The hum you hear is their reactor. It leaks sound through the deep." Thomas's eyes widened. He whispered, "How do you know all this?" She looked at him and said, "Because I helped design them once before I left, before I saw what they could do." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. The crowd shifted uneasily, unsure whether to fear her or thank her. But before anyone could speak, a sudden Tremor shook the pier, water splashed high against the rocks, the sound like thunder rolling beneath their feet. The woman closed her eyes and said quietly, "They are surfacing." Everyone turned toward the sea, the fog parting slightly to reveal a dark outline rising from the deep. It was not a boat, not yet a ship either, but a long black shape like the back of some giant sea creature, metal glinting under the dim light. Screams filled the air, people stumbled backward, some fell. Thomas grabbed a wooden post to steady himself, his mind racing with memories of war days when submarines hunted the coast and the sound of engines meant death. The woman did not move. She stood tall, her eyes on the shape. Her hand gripping the badge tightly, she whispered, "They should not have come here. This is not their water, this is ours." Thomas turned to her, voice shaking. "What are they doing here?" she said. "Testing how we react and waiting to see if anyone notices." The hum deepened into a growl. The fog rippled as if pushed by waves from below, something large moving just under the surface, and then a sound like metal scraping against rock echoed through the harbor. It was sharp and cold and endless. The woman stepped closer to the edge and shouted into the sea, "You are not welcome here. Turn back now." Her voice was strong yet filled with sorrow, as if she already knew they would not listen. The water churned violently, waves slamming against the pier, spraying everyone with salty mist, and through that spray came the faint sound of a horn, deep and distant. The people around her began to run, now panic spreading like fire. Thomas stayed frozen, unable to leave. He watched the woman still facing the fog, fearless like a soldier who had already accepted her fate, she whispered into the wind. "They will not stop until they are warned properly, and I have no choice but to answer." She took something small from her jacket, a round metal device with an antenna. Thomas recognized it instantly, a communicator from the Navy. She pressed a button and a red light blinked weakly. She spoke into it, her voice steady. "This is Echo 7, unidentified vessel detected in civilian waters, coordinates 517 by 920, authorization code Delta 1, responding to contact protocol." The crowd that had mocked her now watched in silence, their fear replaced by awe. The fog began to shift once more, revealing not one but two dark shapes beneath the waves, both massive, both moving slowly toward the harbor. Thomas's mouth went dry. He looked at her and whispered, "What happens now?" She answered simply, "Now we wait for the response." And as the deep hum from the sea grew louder, filling the sky with its strange mechanical song, the woman in civilian clothes stood like a statue at the edge of the pier, her eyes reflecting the ghostly light of the water below her voice. Barely a whisper, yet strong enough to reach every ear. "They think we are blind, but the sea always sees." The wind grew colder as the fog thickened, turning the harbor into a gray wall of mist where every sound echoed like a ghost's whisper. The crowd that had gathered now stood in uneasy silence, their laughter long gone, replaced by heavy breathing and trembling hands. The woman in civilian clothes did not move her face, calm, her eyes sharp as she watched the restless sea. She held the small communicator tight in her hand, waiting for the sound that would tell her she was not alone. Thomas stood beside her, his old heart beating fast, his hands shaking but his eyes fixed on the same fog that hid something vast and dangerous beneath it. A deep metallic rumble came from the water, a sound that seemed to crawl through the ground and into everyone's bones. It was slow, steady, and powerful, the kind of sound that did not belong to nature. Thomas whispered, "They are closer now, aren't they?" The woman nodded. "Yes, closer than they should be. They have ignored the warning." Some people in the crowd began to run away, shouting for their families. Others stayed too afraid to move. A few still whispered that maybe it was a storm or a cargo ship or a trick of the waves, but none of their excuses could stop the fear rising in their throats. The fog began to glow again, faint light flickering inside it like fire trapped underwater. The woman stepped forward, the wood of the pier creaking beneath her boots. She lifted the communicator to her mouth and spoke. "This is Echo 7. Repeat, unauthorized vessel approaching civilian zone coordinates. Confirmed, awaiting response." The air was thick with tension. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the whispering waves, and the faint hum from deep below the woman's eyes never left the fog. Then suddenly, a sharp crackle came from the communicator, followed by a deep voice. "This is Command Identify Threat." Her heart jumped. She pressed the button and answered, "Threat confirmed, submarine class, unidentified potential, hostile requesting visual support immediately." The voice on the other end replied, "Stand by for aerial and naval confirmation. Keep civilians clear." The connection cut off. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The woman turned to the people and shouted, "Everyone back away from the pier. Now leave your boats. Leave everything. Go inland." Her voice was strong, commanding, like a leader giving orders in battle. Some obeyed, running as fast as they could. Others hesitated, staring at her with disbelief. But the sound from the sea left no room for questions anymore. Thomas stayed. He grabbed her arm and said, "If this turns into war, what will happen?" She looked at him and said, "If we are lucky, we will only see a warning shot. If not, then we see what no one should ever see." The fog shifted again, this time parting slowly like a curtain moved by unseen hands, and from behind it, a massive black shape began to rise, the water bubbling and roaring around it as metal broke the surface. It was not a submarine, not a small vessel. It was something far larger, a steel beast with no flag and no name. Gasps filled the air. Screams followed. The woman took a step back, her eyes narrowing as she whispered, "They brought it here." "The prototype." Thomas asked what prototype. She answered, "A weapon made to disappear, a ghost ship." The massive structure kept rising until its full shape towered above the harbor. Waves crashed against the rocks, spraying cold water into the air, and the air smelled of oil smoke and iron. The crowd that had not escaped yet fell to their knees, some praying, some crying, no one laughing anymore. The woman raised the communicator again, her voice urgent. "Command. This is Echo. 7 visual confirmed." Repeating, "Visual confirmed." Massive unmarked vessel surfaced. Within harbor perimeter, no visible crew awaiting orders. Static answered her. No response, only the growling hum from the sea. Thomas grabbed her shoulder, shouting, "They cannot hear you." But she shook her head. "No, they will hear me. They always do." The ship, out in the fog, began to turn, its heavy metal frame grinding with a terrible sound. And from its side a faint red light began to blink, slow and steady like an eye. Waking up, the woman's breath caught. She said quietly, "They are scanning us." Thomas backed away, horror on his face. "Scanning us? Why?" she said. "Because they want to know how much we know, how close they can come before we strike back." She looked around at the terrified faces of the people, at the water splashing higher against the pier, at the massive machine watching them from the fog. And she whispered to herself, "If they want a signal, they will get one." She reached into her coat and took out a small black cylinder, pressing a hidden switch. The device began to flash blue light, pulsing faster and faster. Thomas stared at it and said, "What is that?" She said, "A beacon for the fleet. They will see it, they will come." Moments later, the communicator crackled again. A different voice this time, loud and clear. "Echo. 7. This is Valkyrie. We have your signal. Hold position. Repeat, hold position. Visual contact in 3 minutes." Relief and fear mixed in her eyes. She turned to Thomas and said, "They are coming," he said. "Who?" She answered, "The ones who were never supposed to return." The fog trembled, as if the sea itself recognized the name in the distance. A low, deep horn echoed through the mist, one that made the water vibrate and the clouds shiver, and every person in the harbor feel small. The woman looked toward the sound, her voice soft, but strong. "They will arrive soon, and when they do, everyone will understand why the sea must never be underestimated." Thomas looked at her, his face pale, and whispered, "What will happen when they come?" She said simply, "Silence will fall." And as the massive shadow of the unknown vessel loomed above them, the woman in civilian clothes stood tall, her beacon flashing, her eyes unblinking, her heart steady. While far out beyond the fog, another shape was already cutting through the waves, racing toward the harbor with a roar that promised salvation and destruction at once. The harbor trembled as if the sea itself had come alive. The waves rose higher, crashing against the pier, spraying water over the people who still stood frozen in shock. The fog that had covered the horizon began to shift and glow, a deep gray light breaking through as something vast moved within it. The woman in civilian clothes stood at the edge, her beacon still flashing blue in her hand, her eyes locked on the fog, her body, straight and strong though her heart beat like thunder inside her chest. Thomas stood beside her, clutching the wooden post for balance. His old face pale, his voice shaking as he whispered, "What is coming?" She answered the only thing that can answer, them. The sound came before the sight, a deep hum that grew louder with each passing second, a rhythm like 1,000 engines breathing together. The water shook. The air shook, even the ground seemed to tremble under invisible weight, and then through the curtain of fog, a dark shape began to appear. It was not like the shadow of the ghost ship that had surfaced earlier. This one was bigger, brighter, alive. Metal gleamed under the thin sunlight that broke through the clouds. Massive turrets lined its sides, its flag waving strong against the wind. A voice echoed through the air so deep it felt like the sky itself was speaking. "This is the Royal Defense Vessel Valkyrie. Identify yourself." The woman raised the communicator, her voice clear and steady. "This is Lieutenant Commander Mira Khan, Echo 7, reporting visual on unauthorized vessel within civilian zone target. Confirmed hostile, requesting engagement protocol." Thomas's mouth dropped open. He stared at her, eyes wide. "Lieutenant Commander," he whispered. "You are Navy?" She looked at him, a faint smile in her tired eyes. "Was," she said. "Once they said I was lost, but I never stopped watching the sea." The Valkyrie moved closer, its engines roaring through the fog, its gray metal body towering over the harbor like a mountain on water, its light scanning the surface. The crowd watched in awe and fear. None of them dared to speak. The same people who had mocked her earlier now stood behind her like frightened children hiding behind a parent. Loudspeaker crackled again. "Valkyrie to Echo 7, confirm civilians secure." Mira pressed the button and answered. "Civilians gathered inland, partial evacuation in progress. Requesting permission to engage target command." Replied, "Permission granted. All units on standby, firing sequence initiated." The ghost ship out in the fog began to move too, its metal frame turning with heavy groans, the red light on its side blinking faster and faster like a warning heart. Mira gripped the communicator tighter and shouted to the crowd, "Get down everyone, move away from the pier now." Thomas pulled her arm, trying to pull her back too, but she stayed watching the water, her eyes unblinking. She whispered, "They need coordinates. I have to give them coordinates." She dropped to her knees, spreading the map on the wet wooden planks, her fingers tracing the lines quickly, the numbers flowing from her lips as she spoke into the device. 517 by 920 range, 200 meters forward. Bearing east, mark 120, fire zone clear. The Valkyrie's engines roared louder. Its turrets began to move, turning slowly toward the fog. The people who had not yet fled screamed and ran for cover. Thomas fell to the ground, his heart racing as the air filled with a sound like thunder building in the sky. Mira's voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "Fire on my mark," she said, holding her breath. She stared at the fog, waiting for the flash of the red light from the enemy ship to blink again. When it did, she shouted now. A single deafening boom tore through the air. The water exploded into a wall of white steam and foam. The ground shook. Birds scattered from the cliffs. The fog ripped apart, revealing the black shape of the enemy vessel splitting. Under the force of the blast, its metal screaming like a dying beast, the sea turned, wild waves crashing in every direction. Thomas covered his ears, his eyes filled with tears from the noise. Mira stood still, her hair flying in the wind. The communicator, crackling with the deep voice of command. "Valkyrie reports direct hit target neutralized, zone secure, repeat, zone secure." The people slowly lifted their heads from behind the crates and walls, staring at the sight before them. The fog now clear, the sun breaking through the clouds for the first time that day. The black shape of the enemy vessel sinking slowly into the water, disappearing beneath the waves. Mira lowered her communicator. Her shoulders heavy with relief and sadness, she whispered, "It is done." Thomas walked to her, unsteady, his eyes wide and full of disbelief. He said, "You saved us." She shook her head quietly. "No, the sea saved itself." The loudspeaker from the Valkyrie called again. "Echo 7, report status." She pressed the button and said, "Mission complete, all civilians safe, standing by for retrieval." The voice answered, "Acknowledge standby for transport." The warship's engines softened its siren, sounding once long and deep, like a final note of warning and respect. The people began to gather again, slowly, carefully looking at the woman who had come in silence and brought protection from the mist. They did not laugh anymore. They only watched her with awe and guilt. Tomas looked at her with gratitude and said, "Commander, you came alone against something that could have destroyed us all." And she said softly, "No one is ever alone at sea. The water remembers every voice, every promise, every warning." The Valkyrie turned away, its shadow slowly fading into the horizon, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and salt. The waves calmed, the wind softened, and for the first time that day the harbor was quiet. Mira looked at the place where the ghost ship had vanished, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the sinking sun. She whispered one final line to herself. They never listen until the sea speaks, and now it has spoken. The harbor was quiet again, but it was not the same harbor that had laughed and shouted hours ago. The air was thick with smoke and salt, and the scent of metal burned faintly in the wind. The waves were slow and tired now, like the sea itself was breathing out after holding its breath for too long. The woman in civilian clothes stood on the pier, her jacket soaked, her hair clinging to her, her eyes watching the last ripples where the black ghost ship had sunk beneath the surface. The water was calm, but the memory of what had happened still trembled inside every heart on the shore. Tomas, the old sailor, walked to her slowly, his legs weak, his hands shaking. He had seen war before, but never this close. Never with so much silence afterward. He said softly, "You did it, Commander, you saved us." She turned to him and gave a small, tired smile, her voice gentle and low. "I did what had to be done, nothing more." Behind them, the crowd that had once mocked her now stood in shame, their eyes down, their voices gone. Some of them whispered prayers. Some simply watched her, afraid to speak, afraid that even words might disturb the peace that had settled over the water. The Valkyrie floated in the distance like a giant shadow of protection, its flag fluttering high against the gray sky, its siren silent. Now only the soft hum of its engines broke the quiet. The crew stood along the rail, saluting the woman on the pier, though she wore no uniform, now only plain clothes that could not hide who she truly was. A young boy stepped forward, clutching his mother's hand. He looked up at the woman, his small voice trembling. "Were you really in the Navy, ma'am?" She looked down at him and nodded slowly. "Once I was," she said, "once. But sometimes the sea calls us back, even when we think we have left it behind." The boy stared at her with wide eyes and said then, "Why were you here today? How did you know to come?" She looked toward the horizon where the clouds were clearing, a faint smile touching her lips. "Because the sea never forgets its secrets," she said, "and sometimes it whispers them to those who still listen." Tomas wiped his eyes and said, "I laughed at you. I called you strange and foolish, and yet you stood here when we ran." She turned to him and said kindly, "You only saw what you wanted to see, Tomas. You saw a woman in old clothes, not the storm behind her, but that is human. We all see the surface first. The truth takes time to rise like the tide." The waves lapped gently against the pier. The fog finally began to lift. The sunlight broke through in streaks of gold and silver, shining over the water, lighting up the quiet harbor. People began to breathe again, their shoulders slowly relaxing as if waking from a nightmare. The Valkyrie's radio crackled one last time. "Echo 7 mission. Complete, return for debriefing, repeat. Mission complete." The woman held the communicator for a long moment, then pressed the button, her voice calm and steady. "This is Echo 7. Negative extraction required, civilians safe, target neutralized, standing down." She looked out at the warship, her eyes filled with both pride and sorrow, then said quietly, "Thank you, Valkyrie, job well done." The voice on the radio paused for a moment, then replied, "Understood, Echo 7, farewell, and may calm seas follow you always." The connection